Imagine two countries. Let's call them country A and country B. A country A is better at making cars. And it's also better at making wine. It's better at everything. It has better technology, more skilled workers, more modern factories. Country B is worse at both. Question: should country A trade with country B? What can it gain from trading with someone who's worse at everything? The intuitive answer is a nothing. Why would you buy something from someone who makes it worse than you do? But the correct answer is the opposite. Even when one country is better at everything, both benefit from specializing in trading. Both end up better off. This idea, one of the most counterintuitive in all of economics, is more than 200 years old. And it's still the theoretical foundation of all international trade. In the previous episode, we explored why some countries are rich and others poor. We saw that growth accelerates when countries specialize. But specialize in what? How does a country decide what to devote itself to? Today we're going to understand an idea that answers those questions. It's an idea that seems simple but has profound implications. And it begins in early 19th century England. Before we get to Ricardo, we need a preliminary step. In 1776, Adam Smith had already argued in favor of international trade in The Wealth of Nations. His reasoning was straightforward. If France produces better wine than England, and England produces better wool than France, the solution is obvious. Each produces what it does best and they exchange. Both gain. This is absolute advantage. A country has absolute advantage in a product when it can produce it with fewer resources than another. France needs less labor to make wine. England needs less labor to make wool. Each specializes in its absolute advantage. They trade. Everyone's happy. But Smith left a question unanswered. What happens if one country is better at everything? What if France makes better wine and better wool? Does it make sense for France to trade with England? Smith didn't solve that. Ricardo did. 1817. David Ricardo, a British economist of Portuguese Jewish origin, publishes Principles of Political Economy and Taxation. In that book he presents his most famous example. Ricardo uses two countries, England and Portugal. And two products, cloth and wine. And he gives them numbers. Portugal needs 80 hours of labor to produce 1 unit of wine. England needs 120. Portugal needs 90 hours to produce 1 unit of cloth. England needs 100. Portugal is more efficient at both. It has absolute advantage in everything. According to Smith's logic, it doesn't need to trade with anyone. But Ricardo looks at something different. He doesn't look at who's more efficient in absolute terms. He looks at opportunity cost. Opportunity cost is what you sacrifice by choosing one option. Let's do the math. If Portugal produces 1 unit of cloth, it uses 90 hours. Those 90 hours could have produced 90 divided by 80, that is, 1.125 units of wine. The opportunity cost of one cloth for Portugal is 1.125 wines. If England produces 1 unit of cloth, it uses 100 hours. Those 100 hours could have produced 100 divided by 120, that is, 0.83 units of wine. The opportunity cost of one cloth for England is 0.83 wines. Here's the key. England gives up less wine per cloth. Its opportunity cost for cloth is lower. Even though England is worse at both products in absolute terms, it sacrifices less by devoting itself to cloth than Portugal does. Now flip it. The opportunity cost of one wine for Portugal is 80 divided by 90, approximately 0.89 cloths. For England it's 120 divided by 100, 1.2 cloths. Portugal gives up less cloth per wine. Its opportunity cost for wine is lower. Ricardo concludes Portugal should specialize in wine, where its relative advantage is greatest. And England should specialize in cloth, where its relative disadvantage is smallest. And when both specialize in trade, both come out ahead. Let's see it. Suppose each country has 170 hours of labor. Without trade, Portugal could split them, 80 hours for wine, 90 for cloth, producing 1 unit of each. England could spend 120 hours on wine and only have 50 left for cloth, producing 1 wine and half a cloth. Total between the two, 2 wines and 1.5 cloths. Now with specialization. Portugal devotes all 170 hours to wine, produces 2.125 units. England devotes all 170 hours to cloth, produces 1.7 units. Total, 2.125 wines and 1.7 cloths. More of both products. Both countries can trade and end up with more than they had before. This is comparative advantage. It's not about who's better in absolute terms. It's about who has the lower opportunity cost. And everyone, no matter how inefficient, has comparative advantage in something. Let me take it out of the world of countries for a moment. Imagine a lawyer who's brilliant at her job and also happens to type faster than any available secretary. She has absolute advantage in both law and typing. Should she do her own typing? No. Because every hour she spends typing is an hour she's not practicing law, or her hourly value is much higher. She's better off hiring a secretary even though she types faster, and devoting all her time to what generates the most value. The secretary has comparative advantage in typing. Not because they're better than the lawyer, but because their opportunity cost is lower. This is the essence of comparative advantage. And it applies to people just as it does to countries. Ricardo's comparative advantage is one of the most robust propositions in economic theory. Nearly all economists, of any persuasion, accept it as valid in its theoretical terms. But the theory has assumptions that aren't always met in reality. Ricardo assumed factors of production, labor and capital move freely within a country but not between countries. In today's world, capital moves between countries with enormous ease, and labor also moves, though with more restrictions. That complicates things. Ricardo assumed insignificant transportation costs. In reality, moving goods costs money, and distance matters. And above all, Ricardo said nothing about who wins and who loses within each country when trade opens up. When England specializes in cloth and abandons wine production, English winemakers lose their jobs. The nation as a whole gains. But those specific winemakers don't. In 1933, economists Eli Heckscher and Bertil Ohlin refined the theory. They proposed that countries tend to export goods that intensively use their most abundant factor. A country with lots of cheap labor will export products requiring lots of work. A country with lots of capital will export capital-intensive products. This helped explain real trade patterns. And it also helped explain why trade creates winners and losers within each country, workers whose factor is abundant gain, those whose factor is scarce lose. Japan after World War II illustrates comparative advantage in action. It started exporting textiles and cheap products, where it had an advantage due to low labor costs. As it invested in capital and technology, it shifted toward electronics, automobiles, and precision machinery. Its comparative advantage changed over time. And the country changed with it. Comparative advantage is a powerful argument for trade. But its power doesn't mean trade is painless. When a country opens to trade, some sectors expand and others contract. Workers in contracting sectors can lose their jobs. Their communities can deteriorate. And professional retraining isn't always easy or quick. Economists call this the problem of distributing the gains from trade. Trade increases the total size of the pie. But it doesn't guarantee everyone gets a bigger slice. In many countries, governments have tried to compensate trade's losers with training programs, transition subsidies, and social safety nets. Some have worked. Many, not enough. Comparative advantage explains why trade creates wealth. It doesn't explain why that wealth is often distributed unequally. That tension sits at the center of all the debates about globalization, protectionism, and trade policy dominating public conversation today. We'll explore those debates in greater depth in later seasons. The central ideas from this episode. First, absolute advantage says who produces more with fewer resources. Comparative advantage says who produces at the lowest opportunity cost. They're distinct concepts. Second, Ricardo's big idea is that even a country worse at everything can benefit from trade, because it will always have comparative advantage in something. Both sides gain when they specialize according to their comparative advantage. Third, the Heckscher-Ohlin model expanded the theory. Countries tend to export goods intensive in their most abundant factor. Fourth, comparative advantage explains why trade creates total wealth. But it doesn't resolve the problem of how gains and losses are distributed within each country. Comparative advantage explains why trade makes sense in theory. But in the real world, countries don't trade freely. They use tariffs, quotas, and subsidies. Money crosses borders, trade deficits accumulate, and exchange rates fluctuate. In the next episode, we look at what actually happens when countries trade.